What's up, everybody? I feel like it has been a minute and took a little break. We finished the first season, 8 episodes, I believe, of the Made to Win podcast. And man, I am just overwhelmed with the support, the love, a lot of encouragement. It seems like whenever I travel different places, I'm always running into somebody new that tells me that they listen to the podcast every month. And so for that, I am super grateful. But took a break, obviously had a busy fall, but also wanted to take a break and to get ready for the second season because I wanted to kind of experiment with monthly podcasts. But now I'm excited to say that Made to Win is going to be weekly. That's right, weekly. So I'm dedicating some content and time to making sure that we roll out content every single week. So that'll be every Tuesday, October. This should be October 4th that you are watching or listening, whether you're listening through Apple Podcasts or you're listening through Spotify, or you might be watching on YouTube. Who knows? But so if you guys don't mind, make sure you share this, like my page, follow me on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, but also make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. And then, of course, the website is madetowinpodcast.com. So make sure you do all those things. It would help me out a whole lot because I'm really wanting to expand the exposure. And obviously, I just want to help people. You guys know that I started this podcast because of the journey that I went on to get spiritually healthy. And so that's what this podcast is all about, is helping people take care of their souls, take care of their minds, their spirits, and really focus on soul health. And so I'm really, really pumped. It's going to be a little bit different this season. As you guys know, like I'm here by myself. And so I am going to have guests on this season, but you're also going to see and hear from just me from several episodes. So I hope that's all right. If not, you can always just listen to somebody else, I guess. I don't know. But I'm pumped. So I hope you guys are having a good fall. Man, isn't it crazy? Here in Tennessee anyways, we're having like 60-degree weather. It's crazy. Like I think tomorrow the high is 66. And so fall is here. I wonder how many people love fall. Fall's pretty fun. The only thing I don't like about fall is that winter comes right after fall. So I'm not a cold weather person, but I do love fall. Flannels, hoodies, and all things pumpkin spice. I'm just kidding. I kind of like pumpkin spice, but not as much as some people. Anyways, and in case you are listening from somewhere else, I just want you to know the Vols are undefeated right now, and we are number 8. So I'm sure in a few weeks when we play Alabama, all those things will have changed. But I am going to celebrate right now and just pretend like the college football season should end after 4 games. If that was the case, we'd be undefeated and number 8. So I'm going to rejoice in that. So when you have not been good at football for as long as we have in the last 20 years, you take whatever you can get. So hopefully your team is not doing well so that my team does better. But anyways, I'm pumped, though, because I do think this season is going to be special because I'm going to dedicate pretty much this entire season to a specific theme. And I think it really is just this conversation around our own journeys towards spiritual health. And so what I really want to, even today, I think today's topic is hopefully going to be important to a lot of you all, but I want to talk about just this idea of having an awakening. And I believe most of us, and I'm assuming that if you're listening to this, you're a follower of Jesus, you're a Christian, you're a church person. I don't know too many people that are not Christians listening to this podcast about soul health, but maybe you are. If you are, I'm really pumped for that. I appreciate you listening. But this podcast is specifically geared toward those who call themselves followers of Jesus and really want to get healthy emotionally and spiritually and mentally. So that's what this is about. But I've been talking about this topic with our staff for a little while. I'm actually getting ready to talk about it with our entire church. And definitely want to talk about it on the podcast, but it's just the idea of a spiritual awakening. I think most of us in our journey, whether it's the spiritual journey, our Christian journey, I think we actually experience several conversions. Maybe you've heard of people being converted to Christianity. And what's interesting about this idea of being converted to Christianity is I think that in America, we do a really good job of converting people to becoming Christians. We just don't do a good job of calling people to be disciples. And I think it's creating a problem. I honestly believe since COVID was one of the, I understand that COVID was terrible for a lot of people, and a lot of sickness, a lot of death, those things. But I think in the big picture things, I think historically, anytime there has been maybe chaos or times seem just in despair, that is when the church has grown the most. I mean, when you think about how persecution started with the early church, the Bible actually tells us that the church flourished and grew in the midst of persecution, death, disease. I mean, all of the different chaos and the different situations, the church has always flourished during those times. And I think what we're even seeing in the last 2 years, they're calling this particular period of time the Great Resignation. They're saying at least 40 to 50% of all medical field workers, whether you're doctors or nurses, teachers and pastors, are either resigning and quitting altogether or want to quit. And so when you think about that, and especially for some of you in the medical field, you're feeling the weight of that. You're feeling the weight of having a shortage on nurses, doctors, teachers, especially. Even in our community, man, there's such a weight. They can't even find enough substitute teachers a lot of times. They're having to combine classrooms because during the pandemic, people just got burnt. And people don't help people a lot of times, right? I mean, sometimes you know that you're in that place of burnout when the very thing you signed up to do, which is help people, teach people, lead people, becomes the thing that you hate getting up and doing every day. And that's kind of what we've seen. And I think even in this process, what we are seeing is God purifying his church, where a lot of times what we are seeing that we thought worked and was working in the church really was maybe a few fads. It was a few things that maybe constituted a greater desire for consumeristic church. But at the end of the day, when chaos hits, when the storms hit, that is when we are stripped down to the bare thing that we have built. And I think, at least for me as a pastor, and I've even talked to other pastors, I'm in a pastor's cohort that we meet every Monday, having these same centered conversations around. A lot of pastors are saying COVID showed them what they had spent so much time building, and they were deeply saddened on what they had built. Because you saw a lot of people just dip on the church. I mean, I know it's crazy because even our church personally, we didn't, I guess, take as much hit as a lot of churches or pastors I've talked to as far as like maybe attendance or giving or all those things. But here's the interesting part is that most of the people that have come back aren't people who were here before. And so some churches are even seeing a 30 to 50% transplant rate, where it's like they're back to maybe pre-COVID numbers, but half of their church are different people. And so I'm saying all this to set up the conversation for today, because I think one of the things that God has shown me, especially in the last 5 years, I would say specifically, ever since 2015, I always tell people I went on this journey. My dad died suddenly in 2015. If you know my story, I didn't get to know my biological father until I was about 15. Really struggled for most of my late teen, early adult, and adult years trying to restore and reconcile that relationship. A lot of it was on me. I don't deny that. It was just super difficult. I was a young Christian trying to figure out how to forgive, how to move past things. It was difficult to see him as my father. We actually became pretty decent friends, but it was really difficult for me to even, I guess, have that father-son relationship. And here's what I know about every man, really it's probably true for women too, but especially men, is that regardless of relationship with your earthly father, like when they die, there's just like this inward soul search that begins to happen. And so 2015 happens, my dad passes away suddenly of a heart attack, and all things internally began to fall apart. I had a few other traumatic things happen. I shared that in season 1. So in a matter of 2015, basically a year and a half to 2 years, me and my wife both walked through a series of traumas that rocked us to our core. Well, in that, I went on this soul-searching journey, and I have a good friend, Pastor Lance Johnson, who kind of just presented this idea of a week in solitude and prayer. And it was this idea of like, he did this whole camping trip where it was just him, and later on in life, his 2 boys. He would do a week with his 2 boys and a week by himself. And he just fished, camped, spent time alone with God. And so I went and visited him for a few days on his sabbatical just to kind of see how he did things. And I was like, man, this could be something that I started doing. And so I think it was 2016. I did my first ever solitude sabbatical. Super strange. It was hard. It was weird. Not because it was camping or anything, because I enjoy those things. But for the first time really in my life, I don't know if I've ever spent that much time alone. And then maybe you're thinking as you're listening, like, I don't know that I could spend an entire week by myself. But maybe you're like just deathly introverted and you're like, man, that sounds like the greatest time of my life. But I am a 7 on the Enneagram. So that's like, I mean, almost torture, or was. Now I've grown to love it. But during that time, I would take books, I would have reading plans, I would pray about like personal growth, family growth, church, how am I going to minister to the church over the next several years. During that process, God has just led me to different arenas, and I started reading books that just, and started really diving deep into the scriptures about this idea of soul health. And God just started rocking me to my core, especially as a pastor, thinking on things of how we've even built our church in the last 10 years. And we've seen God do some incredible things. And here's what I tell people a lot of times is like, the thing about God is he will do things in spite of us many times. And I can definitely say that's probably true for the first 5 years as a church, is that, God blessed in incredible ways, and he has moved in incredible ways here at Generation Church, but a lot of times in spite of me, because I was not healthy emotionally, mentally, or spiritually for the first 5 to 6 years of me pastoring this church, and we just celebrated 10 years. So it's really the last 4 years I've experienced my own personal, what's called awakening. And here's what I believe. I believe many of us, and this is kind of goes back to how I started the conversation, I think along the way, we all have several conversion moments. Some of us do. Some of us never get past the first one because we're so screwed up by it. But I think often, especially in the South, here's what we experience. And I know if you're a pastor in the South, maybe this is your experience too, is people feel like they have to be saved multiple times. Like I can't tell you how many people we've baptized and then come to find out later, oh, well, I was saved and baptized when I was a kid, and then maybe in my 20s, and like this is their 3rd time being baptized and their 3rd time coming to the Lord. And you're like, there is something deeply wrong with the formation of people's theology in the South specifically. And I'm speaking from my perspective. I can't speak from northeastern perspective, Western perspective, because, I haven't pastored there or been in those cultures. I do know it is different. I do know the further northeast you go, you get more into really Orthodox or Catholic settings and things like that. So I can't speak to all of those things, but I can speak to the South. And in the South, we get people who walk through our doors. They've been quote unquote saved multiple times, multiple times being baptized, all of those things. And I think what happens is we misidentify these conversion moments. Let me break it down for you. I think there's the first conversion moment that we have, which is called informational salvation. Now, informational salvation is I can make a mental decision based off of information given to me, right? And it happened to me personally when I was 12. And it usually starts off with some sort of form that looks like this. Do you want to go to hell? And as a child, I mean, think about what you're asking a kid or asking a young person or asking any kind of person maybe who doesn't know the Bible. And you're like, hey, do you want to go to this place and burn forever? And you're like, hell no, right? And it's like, I don't want to go to this place and burn. Well, what do I need to do? Well, you need to say this prayer. If you say this prayer, you'll be saved and go to heaven, and you won't burn in hell. And so, I mean, you're like, man, that makes sense to me. You know, I can say a prayer. I can do that. That's all it's going to cost me is say a prayer. I'm good to go with that. We say the prayer. We get baptized, and then we're really just left there. I think we've left so many Christians standing outside the tank dripping. And so we have all of these Christians who have gotten dunked, but the seats are still wet with just this basic level of information to get into heaven. And when you start studying the gospel and studying what Jesus has called us to, it's deeper than that. It's bigger than that. Not that salvation, and we'll talk about this, I'm not saying salvation is earned. I'm just saying I think that we have communicated for far too long that salvation is simply a transaction. It's an information-based thing. Believe the information, say the prayer, you're done. So that's kind of like the first conversion that some of us, especially in the South, have experienced. The second one is probably like our actual salvation. I always tell people, and I'm speaking from my own personal experience, this is the moment where information meets the Holy Spirit, right? Like you have, because I think sometimes we go to the other extreme that we say that we think that somehow being a person of faith means you got to take out all information and thinking instead of realizing that all of those things go together. But this is when you truly give your heart to Jesus. You trust him with your salvation, your sin, and you become a Christ follower. You begin this Christian journey. For me, and for many of you, maybe it looked like this. It was like, okay, I'm going to start making a decision to go to church every week. For me back then, it was, I'm going to make sure I show up for Sunday school, not just church, but church and Sunday school. And then we had Sunday night service. And then we had Wednesday night Bible study or youth service, whatever it was. That was the kind of the next steps or the extent of my faith journey. Is like, this is what I got to do next, is I just got to be at church all the time. And you probably stop trying to do some of the things that you knew were wrong in the first place. You know, you're going to try to stop cussing. You're going to try to stop looking at inappropriate things or saying inappropriate things or whatever it may be. That's kind of the extent of that salvation experience. And so the scary thing is many people never make it to the third conversion moment I want to talk about. They're never awakened to the grace that comes with a word called awareness. It's this awareness. And this third conversion moment is this moment of like, you know, my Christianity is not just saying, I believe in Jesus and I want to go to heaven, but it's this moment of like, Jesus died to get heaven into me, to transform me from the inside out. It really is this journey for spiritual formation. That's this third conversion. And this third conversion, this spiritual formation, is when I submit to full apprenticeship to Jesus so that he can begin to transform me from the inside out to become more like him, less like myself. We say it like this at our church, that there is a you that you haven't met yet. And so it's this line, because it's the people that you meet all the time that, man, they have been a quote unquote church-going Christian for 20 years, but they're not a 20-year-old Christian. They're a 1-year-old Christian 20 times over. They're the same person that they were. They just go to church a lot now and maybe can quote a few more Bible verses, because the extent of our salvation was information and then participation. And that was it. You know, as long as you participate in church things, maybe do a few church things, but there really wasn't this soul transformation. It's even this almost like a calling to where, man, it's this awakening moment of there is something deeper, beautiful, profound, and abundant about this way of Jesus. And it's nothing like the world has to offer. And that's kind of what I'm talking about today, is that moment. That my prayer is that more and more quote unquote Christians would have this awakening moment, this calling moment of like being called to apprenticeship. It's the, maybe you've been that Christian who's been still at the boat for far too long, but you're having that beach moment with Jesus when he says, follow me, and you drop your nets to become an apprentice or a personal follower of Jesus. I tell our church that the drop your nets moment is when you rearrange your life to prioritize becoming an apprentice to Jesus, learning to be with Jesus, be like Jesus, live your life as if Jesus were you. That's what it means to be an apprentice. And I think that word apprentice has such a stronger appeal than disciple, because everybody has a view of discipleship. For most Christians or churches, it's a program, it's a Bible study, it's a whatever. But true discipleship is actually translated to the word apprenticeship. It's when I say I am placing myself under the authority. I'm going to say I'm going to become like my rabbi or my teacher or my savior. It really is being transformed into Christ likeness. And there's tons of scripture to back up what we're talking about in this moment, that Christianity is bigger than just believing. I mean, the Bible even says that demons believe and they tremble. So if belief was the only reason why Jesus came, why teach all the Sermon on the Mount? Why have all these parables? Why not just say, hey, believe, watch me die, watch me do this trick, watch me die, come back from the dead, believe that I rose, you're good to go. But that is part of our salvation journey, is believing in the resurrection of Jesus. But that's only the beginning of our discipleship journey. And Jesus called every believer into discipleship, not just the smart. I mean, if it was only for the religious elite, he wouldn't have called fishermen. He wouldn't have called religious zealots. He wouldn't have called tax collectors. But that is the beauty of the gospel, is that the salvation is free, but discipleship costs us something. And I think that's what we want to talk about even today. And so I think on this journey, if we only look at our faith journey as going to church, maybe doing a few devotionals, doing things like those, things don't necessarily keep our zeal for the Lord going, because those things become habits or ritual. They become, it's interesting because our human nature is to turn everything into legalism. It's to turn everything into a have to, instead of I delight in this. And that's what I want to talk about, because I want to give you a quick definition of an awakening, but it's a moment of becoming suddenly aware of something, to awake from sleep. I mean, to experience an awakening is to wake up and be fully willing to see and name where you've been stuck. Because maybe you're listening to this podcast and you're stuck. You're stuck in your walk with God. You're stuck in your spirituality. You're in one of those seasons where, because I see it, man, I see it all the time, especially now that I'm a pastor. I've been pastoring for 10 years now, and I saw it as a youth pastor, but I see it even more now as a pastor, where it's like you have this, maybe it's a new believer or a couple that's just gotten into church, and man, it's like their faith is red hot, man, and they're just whatever. I mean, they don't miss a Sunday, even when they're on vacation. They're watching online, like they're what can I do to serve? And then it's just like, as life goes on, all of a sudden you don't see them for 6 weeks, and you don't see them for 2 months. And then you might see them again for a few weeks, and they're out. The average church goer right now attends once out of every 6 weeks. That's the average in America right now. I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. Once every 6 weeks. And then what happens is that people get so apathetic in their faith, they become bitter, give up, and here's what they do is they end up blaming the institution instead of looking inward and go like, man, did I ever really make a decision to follow Jesus? Or did I just make a decision to believe and go to church? Because it's so different than the biblical story of Jesus and this gospel that transforms people from the inside out, that takes murderers into gospel sharers, that takes somebody who denied Christ 3 times to now he's giving his life crucified upside down because he's telling people, hey, I saw the resurrected Jesus. Like, that doesn't happen just because he started going to church. It happened because he had a real encounter with the resurrected King. And so that's my prayer for you that are listening, is like, man, I want you to have an encounter with the resurrected King that gives you this awakening. And so I just want to talk about a couple of things real quick. And as we start this journey to have an awakening and go on this journey in your own sanctification process, and talk about soul health and your discipleship. And the first thing is this: an awakening. We need an awakening to our formation and discipleship to Jesus. That's what we're talking about today. There was a book by Dallas Willard called The Great Omission. And he says basically the church in America today has omitted the last part of the Great Commission. You know, we love to talk about, like, Jesus said, go tell everybody about Jesus and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we're like, yeah, we cheer that on. But then he says, teach them to obey everything I have commanded. And that's the thing that we have omitted and left out, is we're really good at going and telling. We're really good at baptizing. But a lot of churches have become really bad at teaching people to obey everything Jesus has commanded. And so here's the thing: is you cannot separate evangelism and discipleship. I was talking to a pastor friend recently. I'm in this pastor's cohort. I'm not going to mention his name because he's a local pastor. Pastor's a very influential church, but he said when he first started pastoring this church, he made an emphasis on discipleship. He's like, we're going to dive deep. And he said, this church has a great evangelism culture, terrible discipleship culture. And his first sermon series was called The Great Omission. And he goes on this journey with discipleship with his church. And when he said, every time I said the word discipleship, what people heard was, we don't care about evangelism anymore. And he said for 5 years, his church saw a decline. And he said, but we knew we were building something strong behind the scenes and at the core. And eventually, like, for 2 years in a row, they baptized 1,000 people in a year. Like, it was incredible, the revival they've seen based off of prayer and the presence of God and spiritual formation. And so I want you to know, evangelism and discipleship are not separate entities. They are the same. Because if you are being formed in the image of Christ and you are dedicated to your apprenticeship to Jesus, what's a byproduct of that? You're going to tell others. You're going to invite others into this journey. You're going to invite others into this whole idea of believing and following Christ and surrendering your life to him. And so sometimes I think it's either or. We either have to be super evangelistic or super disciple. And most people who view discipleship, they view discipleship as, we're going to sit in our homes all the time and read our Bibles and just wait on Jesus to come back. And neither of those things are true. What's true is that the more I become like Christ, then the more missional I'm going to be. I'm going to be missional in everything that I do, not just inviting people to church, but inviting people into my life, saying, hey, come see my life because it's been transformed by this God. And his name is Jesus. And when I surrender my life to him, my life becomes abundant. It becomes joyful. It is changed. The fruit of the Holy Spirit takes root and things begin to change. And so when we focus on our discipleship to Jesus, we will automatically become evangelists for Jesus. So if you want to write that down, you can. If you're taking notes, if you're sitting listening to this, but if you're driving, I want to say that one more time. If you're just listening in your vehicle or maybe at the gym, but when we focus on our discipleship to Jesus, we will automatically become evangelists for Jesus. It's a byproduct. Evangelism is a byproduct of our discipleship. It's not the other way around. It's not just an option. It's a byproduct. And so it's just reminding, when we talk about this idea of formation, we are already being formed by something or someone. All of us are, whether it's intentional or not intentional. But I want you to be reminded of this, that the Bible barely uses the word Christian, but the word disciple or apprentice is the primary word used for Christ followers. Because being an evangelistic church for the last 10 years, I can tell you there are 4 words that most American churches live by, and that is butts, budgets, buildings, and buzz. And it has hurt the church and hurt pastors, because pastors become consumed with those four things. We got to get butts in the seats. We got to meet budget and exceed that so that we can build buildings. Oh, and we got to have a buzz on social media. People got to be talking about us. And those four things have driven the wrong goals and metrics in the local church. And so some people will listen to this, and maybe you'd even say, well, yeah, that's the reason why I quit going to church. But that's the problem, is that even us personally, we've put our own discipleship in the hands of somebody else. I just want to remind you, if your epiphany or your awakening or your shift in your spirit causes you to condemn, judge, or move away from people in the church, you didn't have an awakening. You just got angry. And that's not of God. Anytime God leads us to a revelation or an awakening with him, it's always going to start with you first. You never point fingers at anyone else. That's the last 4 years. I want you to know, man, conviction has hit me. Change has hit me. I look at my own faults, failings, and fears, because I think our MO many times is to go, well, I'm this way because of this pastor, this church, these people. But every awakening leads to somebody's self-transformation and saying, like, this starts with me first. And hopefully the fruit that comes out of my own formation will show people it's possible and lead them to their own awakening. And last but not least, change requires a cost. Change requires a cost. You see, our culture tends to flock to the sources that doesn't ask anything of them. Think about it. We're consumed by Netflix, social media, our streaming devices, phones, because other than our money, it doesn't cost us anything. None of them are requiring you to change who you are. Netflix doesn't say, yeah, you can subscribe to us as long as you commit to being this kind of person. It doesn't happen. They don't care who you are. They just care about getting your money, right? Because you know why? Because it's easier to be inspired by stories instead of live one of your own. That's how most of us live our lives. It's the reason why several people walked away when they approached Jesus about being his disciple. Most of them wanted what it looked like to be a disciple, but when Jesus gave them what it cost, many of them had excuses why they couldn't follow. And I think that's just that moment, because when they walked away, Jesus never said, oh, wait a minute, it's okay. You don't have to do all those things. Just believe. Like, Jesus never said that. In fact, really his message was believe, repent, and follow. That was kind of the whole message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? Believe, in this gospel, but also become my disciple. Follow, abide. John. And you start reading in John, and you read about how he talks about this whole idea of abiding in the vine, right? That he is the vine, we are the branches. And in those first 15 verses, I want to say it's John, maybe it's John 8. It's either John 8 or John 10. I can't really remember off the top of my head right now. First 15 verses, he uses the word abide 10 times. And it's this idea of staying connected to the presence of God, because that's what produces the fruit in our lives. And guess what? That requires change. It costs us something. Salvation is free, but discipleship costs us something. And so I think it's, for many of us, if we're honest with ourselves, it's so much easier to invite people to church instead of actually living out a life devoted to Christ, because then it's always on somebody else, right? Like, all I did was invite them. And I think and there's nothing wrong. Like, I want you to invite people to church. I want you to bring lost people. I want you to bring the unchurched, de-churched, all those things. But from a believer standpoint, we've kind of left that as our only obligation to being a Christian, is to get somebody in the church doors. When really it should be, I want to invite you to see my life because it's been transformed by the Spirit of God. And so we talk a lot about consumerism in the church, but consumerism is not just the feed me mentality. It's the excuse me mentality. It's the mentality that always has an excuse as to why we won't submit to discipleship to Jesus. All of us have an excuse. We're going to talk about some of those excuses next week, but I just want to remind you, salvation is free. I mean, it's a gift. But our transformed lives cost us something. But I want you to know that's our gift back to him. Our gift back to him is a life transformed. It's saying, God, I took this gift you gave me and I worked it out in my soul. And now this life I offer to you is a life of obedience. It's a life of joy. It's the abundant life Jesus came to give. And so that's the thing that I want to challenge you with today. I told our staff, I've never been more excited as a pastor and yet terrified. Because as we go on this journey as a church to focus on formation, discipleship, community, and being the church God has called us to be, I told them one of two things will happen. People will be so hungry for this that they'll dive in and will become a community of deep love, prayer, and formation that leads to revival. Or many people will leave in search of another place where they can simply consume. Because that's where most of us are. Most of us don't even know the definition of the word longevity or consistency or commitment. Most of us are temporary, seasonal, and really we just go through a gamut of emotions. If I feel emotionally charged about this, because we all love something new, right? And that's why most of us will be somewhere else every few years, because it's easier. It's easier to run to a feeling than it is to a foundation. And so that's the thing that we're wrestling with, right? But here's what I want you to know is either way, God is in control. Because we talk a lot about unity as a church. Maybe you're a pastor listening and you're like, man, I just want my church to be unified. I mean, that's what Jesus preached. That was the challenge he gave his disciples before he went to the cross was, man, I want you guys to be one. All through the New Testament, you see this whole idea and charge to be unified, to be one. But the harsh reality is sometimes people have to leave in order for unity to become possible. Because sometimes the people who aren't interested in unity need to be purged from the church. So this season, I'm telling you, I'm already starting off. I know this is kind of like already like a hot topic, but this season is going to be jam-packed with good stuff and helping you in your journey towards your awakening, towards soul health, power and presence, formation, and discipleship. We're going to have some really cool guests. I can't wait to have some of those on, talk through some of those things. I'm also going to be sharing with you my personal journey and also want to answer any questions you have. Maybe there's some things that you want to discuss and talk about. So don't forget that you can go to the website, madetowinpodcast.com, submit questions. Don't forget to follow me again on Instagram. Don't forget to go check out Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Make sure you subscribe to all those things, like them. But I want to give you 3 keys to victory before we end this episode. The first one, this is what I really want you to do. I want you to reflect on the current condition of your own discipleship to Jesus. Like I really want you to do that in the next week. Reflect on your own condition of your own discipleship. And don't look at it through the lens of what other people are doing or blame anybody. But let's say like, hey, what is my current condition of me saying, I want to be with Jesus, be like Jesus, live my life as if he were me. 2, I want you to reflect on what needs to change in your everyday life in order for you to experience your own awakening. In other words, what's it going to cost you? What are your excuses? What are the excuses I use as to why I call myself a believer, but I can't call myself an apprentice? And number 3, confess where you are in full transparency. That's the cool thing is God already knows. So why not have a conversation with him about it and say, God, this is just the truth. But not only that, get in a community of grace and truth of other people and work it out through them. Tell somebody. I hope this episode was helpful. Man, I know it's super vulnerable, but man, that's what this show is all about. That's what this whole podcast is about, is just helping people become real, vulnerable, and healthy in their soul walk and emotional health. So I love you guys. I hope you guys will tune in next week as we jump into episode 2. But don't forget, we were made to win, but winning starts from within.